Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be looking at the 2022 midterm election results and doing an analysis of it and looking at how my predictions held up. Before I start, I'd like to say if you like my channel and my content, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you know when we upload, and also leave a like and comment. With that said, let's get into it. So, as I'm sure you all know, the red wave did not happen, at least not nationally. There were some states that had very good results for Republicans and some states that had very good results for Democrats, and ultimately it ended up kind of being a wash. The House of Representatives has not officially been called yet, but Republicans are at 217 and they need 218, and they're leading in several districts right now. So it's extremely likely that Republicans are going to take back the House of Representatives, although it's by a much smaller margin than I think anyone really expected. My final House prediction had Republicans at 234 House seats, and the comments actually kind of gave me some crap for that. They said, "Oh, you're underestimating Republicans a lot," but it turns out I was actually overestimating Republicans a little bit. I actually went against the consensus on a bunch of districts, and it turns out I was still wrong, and I overestimated Republicans. As for the Senate elections, we can see here that Democrats held on to every seat they had and gained Pennsylvania. Georgia is technically still up in the air, but I'm going to get into that a little more later. But they have not lost a seat yet. Georgia's going to a runoff. And as for the governor elections, Democrats held on to almost every seat that they had. The only seat that they lost was Nevada. Again, I'll get into that later. But they picked up Maryland, Massachusetts, and Arizona. As for my predictions, I was way off on the statewide races. I had Republicans at 52 to 47. I had Georgia going to a runoff. And I did say that Georgia was going to favor whoever won the Senate overall in the runoff. So I did say I think Walker was favored. Now, obviously, I think Warnock is favored because, like I said, whoever wins the Senate is probably going to win the Georgia runoff because of which side is going to be more motivated. So right now, I do think that's the Democrats. It's not impossible for Walker to win, and I'll probably make a video on the Georgia runoff sometime before it happens. But this is what my prediction was. Obviously, I was way off. I got Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Arizona wrong. As for the governor elections, I got a couple states wrong here too. Oregon, in my final prediction on YouTube, I did have Oregon Republican, but then there were a couple polls that came out after that had Oregon going blue. So personally, I did think that Kotek was going to win, but on the channel, I did have Oregon Republican, so I have it filled in Republican here. As for the other states I got wrong, I got Wisconsin wrong by a couple points, which actually did surprise me. I did think that Michaels was going to beat Evers here. Laura Kelly, like I said in my final prediction video, there weren't many polls out of Kansas. I wish they had done more polling here. I said that Kansas was going to go red just because I thought the national environment was going that way, and I was just wrong about that. And probably the biggest surprise on the governor level was the fact that Kari Lake lost to Katie Hobbs in Arizona. Kari Lake was ahead in the polls for basically the entire cycle. So Katie Hobbs winning actually was very surprising to me. Of course, in the states that I did call right, I was off in my margins in a couple places, which I will get into in a little bit. And actually, I had Alaska as likely Republican in my final prediction, but I did get a lot of margins wrong too, and also on the Senate map. So I'm just going to go through these results in the Senate and the governor's races, and maybe a little bit in the House, and just talk about what happened and why I got my predictions wrong. So I'm going to start by talking about the state of New Hampshire. Maggie Hassan won by almost 10 points here, which is kind of crazy. Leading up to the election, the polls in this race on the Real Clear Politics average converged and were basically tied. At one point, Don Bolduc was actually narrowly ahead of Maggie Hassan. So I definitely thought this race was going to be close. I did think Hassan was going to win, but the fact that she won by 9 points is very surprising to me. And polling was off all over the country, but even the good pollsters in New Hampshire and national pollsters underestimated Hassan in this race. St. Anselm nailed the 2020 election and had Bolduc leading by 1. So I'm not really sure what happened with them this cycle. And Emerson also only had Hassan leading by 4, and like I said, she won by 9. Going to the governor election in New Hampshire, Chris Sununu did win, but he only won by 16 points, and that sounds like it's a huge margin of victory, but I think in 2020 Chris Sununu won by 30 points, so his margin shrunk by a lot in this race. Going to neighboring Maine, I had this one as likely Democrat. At one point, I even had it as lean Democrat because there wasn't really much polling here, and I thought the environment was going to be in Republicans' favor. But Janet Mills ultimately ended up beating Paul LePage by 13%. It didn't even go to a second round in the ranked choice voting. It seemed like Janet Mills was a much stronger incumbent than people realized, and Paul LePage was just not as popular as people had hoped. Staying in the Northeast, we have Massachusetts, which was a solid Democrat flip in almost every rating, but it is worth noting that these two states, Massachusetts and Maryland, did flip. The Democrats got 60% of the vote plus in each race. I think that's worth noting. Also worth noting is how Josh Shapiro totally just demolished Doug Mastriano in the state of Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro was up by double digits in the polls, and he was still underestimated. He ended up beating Doug Mastriano by almost 15 points, which is unheard of in Pennsylvania. Well, it's not that it's necessarily unheard of in Pennsylvania. I believe Tom Wolf won by a bigger margin in 2018. But the fact that this happened in a year that was supposed to favor Republicans, in a year where Joe Biden was president, is extremely notable. Looking at the county results, you can really just see how well Josh Shapiro did in this race. In Erie, he won by over 20 points. He won Beaver County. This is a county that voted for Oz. There were a lot of counties here that voted for Oz, and you can just see that the entirety of eastern Pennsylvania voted for Josh Shapiro. Doug Mastriano almost lost Lancaster County, which I didn't even think that was possible for a Republican to do, but he almost did it. And in my opinion, Doug Mastriano kind of dragged down the entire Republican ticket in this race. If we go to the Senate results, we can see that John Fetterman outperformed polling and basically all expectations, and he beat Dr. Oz by a little over 4 points. And like I said before, we can see there are a couple Oz-Shapiro counties, and it's not even like they were really close. Dr. Oz won this county by 8 points. And if you just compare the two maps, you can see that eastern Pennsylvania was a lot less blue than it was in the governor race, in the Senate race. You can see Cumberland County here voted for Shapiro and voted for Oz. It wasn't even a really super close Oz County. Ultimately, Shapiro outperformed John Fetterman by over 10 points. So I think that if anyone really other than Doug Mastriano had been nominated to go against Josh Shapiro, I think Josh Shapiro still would have won, but I don't think it would have dragged down the ticket this much. I think Dr. Oz probably would have won if Doug Mastriano wasn't on the ticket. And it isn't even just the Senate race that I think Mastriano weighed down the Republican Party on. If you look at the House results, Matt Cartwright won by 3 points. Susan Wild won by less than 2 points. It's very probable that both of these candidates would have gone down to their Republican challengers if Mastriano wasn't on the ticket. Mastriano probably did cause the blue wave in Pennsylvania. And if you look at PA 17, this was supposed to be close, but Chris DeLuzio ended up winning by almost 7 points. So in the midst of a year where Republicans had really good results in some states and really bad results in some states, Pennsylvania is one of the bluest states really on this map. But Pennsylvania, of course, is not the only state where Democrats outperformed expectations. Going to Michigan, we can see that in a bunch of swing districts, Democrats outperformed. Daniel Kildee held on by over 10 points. He was supposed to be in a very competitive race, but he won by double digits here. Alyssa Slotkin won by 5 points here. I expected her to lose, but she didn't. John Gibbs underperformed by a lot. He lost by 13 points almost, which is insane. The pundit consensus for this district is that it was going to be a lean Democrat flip, but John Gibbs totally underperformed here. He lost by double digits. It was supposed to be a lean D race, and he ended up losing by 13 points, which is just incredible. And of course, similarly to Pennsylvania, this is a lot because of the governor race, which Gretchen Whitmer won by over 10 points. This ended up being a solid Democrat race, which is crazy. Unlike Doug Mastriano, I don't think this is entirely Tudor Dixon's fault because there was a lot of drama in the primary with candidates being disqualified that kind of probably brought down Republican turnout in Michigan. And also, Gretchen Whitmer was just a lot more popular, I think, than people gave her credit for. And so she was able to win Michigan by a pretty huge margin. I think it might be bigger than her 2018 margin. I forget the exact numbers, but it's pretty close. Going back to the nationwide map here for the governors, we can see that Tony Evers hung on by a couple points in Wisconsin, which I definitely did not expect. I thought Tim Michels was going to win. I did have it more narrow, I think, than the consensus gave it, but I definitely expected Michels to win. And Tony Evers ended up winning by 3.5 points, which actually was an expansion on his 2018 margin, which I definitely did not expect. But Wisconsin as a whole was a lot bluer than people expected, I think. In the Wisconsin Senate race, Ron Johnson only won by 1 point. I think this is my biggest miss on the Senate level margin-wise. I expected Johnson to win by like 6 or 7, and he only won by 1 point. He actually underperformed the polls, which has never happened to Ron Johnson statewide before. Going to the House of Representatives elections in Wisconsin, most of these seats were safe for either party, but in the 3rd district, Derek Van Orden was supposed to win by a likely margin. it was rated by likely in the consensus, and Derek Van Orden only won by 3 points here. This is a Republican pickup and definitely helped their path to victory in the House of Representatives, but the fact that he only won by 3 points when he was supposed to win by a much larger margin is just proof that Wisconsin kind of shocked everyone and was a lot more blue than expected this year. In the state of Illinois, the Democratic gerrymanders ended up proving to be very good because all of these districts ended up going blue. Even the 17th district ended up going blue, which actually does surprise me, even considering the results that happened, because if we go to the Illinois governor map, this race was actually closer than I expected it to be. J.B. Pritzker only won by about 10 points here. So the fact that Pritzker actually underperformed, but Esther King still lost in her bid here. Let's see if it loads. Okay, there we go. The fact that Esther King still lost to Eric Sorensen was actually very surprising to me. All right, next I'm going to go down to North Carolina here. In the 13th district, Wiley Nickel won against Bo Hines by around 3 points. This was a lean Republican district, I think, in all of the consensus ratings, and I am definitely surprised that Wiley Nickel won here. I did expect that the Senate race was going to be closer than the polls were giving it credit for. So going to North Carolina, Ted Budd only won by 3.5 points roughly. I said he was going to win by a little over 4, so I think I kind of nailed this race. I was within a point. I definitely didn't move it to likely Republican. A lot of people moved this race to likely Republican because the polls were going in Budd's favor. I didn't think that was going to happen. And judging by Trump's 2016 win, 2020 win in this state, that was extremely narrow. I didn't think that Ted Budd was going to win by a huge margin here. And I was right, but he did end up still winning. It was a lot closer than expected, though. Going down to Georgia, I'm going to talk about the Senate race first. Raphael Warnock led in the first round, but he did not crack the 50%, so this is going to a runoff. As I mentioned earlier in my prediction, I said that I think whichever party takes back the Senate is going to be the party of the winner in the Georgia runoff election. And I still think that's true. However, now we know that the Democrats have taken back the Senate, so I do think Warnock is going to win this just because I think Republicans are going to be demotivated by the fact that they thought there was this big red wave coming nationally, and it just didn't materialize. I'm going to come back to the governor race later because I'm going to talk about the good Republican results after the good Democrat results. So I'm going to move to Washington and Colorado here. Both of these ended up being solid Democrat races, and briefly I did move both of these to solid Democrat races, and I feel like such an idiot for moving them back to likely. I would have been right. I would have been dead on if I just kept them in the solid category, but the polls were very close in both of these races, relatively anyway, and they ended up going by double digits to each candidate. I think Oregon was actually, okay, ultimately it wasn't because more votes have been counted, but the fact that Oregon and Washington were within about a point of each other was actually kind of surprising given the polling in Washington, but Oregon actually ended up being relatively close too. A big surprise was that the New York Senate election was actually closer than the Colorado and Washington Senate elections, and that's because of the governor race, which I will, of course, talk about in a little bit here. But Chuck Schumer only won by 13 points here, and Washington was a 15-point Democrat victory, and Colorado was a 14-point Democrat victory. So the fact that New York was closer than both of these states was actually extremely surprising to me. Going to the Colorado House of Representatives results, Lauren Boebert is ahead here very narrowly. This was a likely Republican race, according to pundits, and Lauren Boebert is getting by the skin of her teeth with 95% in. I think you could probably call this one here. I don't think Frisch really has a path to victory, so that would give Republicans the House here. But the fact that it's not called a week after Election Day is actually crazy. Going up to Washington, too. Where's the 3rd district? Okay, here's the 3rd district. So Joe Kent actually lost this race. This was another likely Republican race that ended up going blue. Joe Kent primaried the incumbent here who voted to impeach Trump, and a lot of people thought he was still going to win here, but he actually ended up losing, which I find this to be pretty shocking too, especially because the 5th district actually went Republican in Oregon. This was another race where the incumbent was primaried, except this time it was a moderate Democrat who was primaried by a progressive Democrat. And so it seems like on the West Coast here, the more extreme candidates actually ended up losing. Moving down to Arizona in the congressional level, there weren't too many surprises here, although the 6th district was actually a lot closer than I was expecting. I think I had it as lean Republican, but at one point I think I had it as likely Republican, and this ended up being a very close race here. But ultimately, all of the districts went the way that they were expected to, just the margins were a little off in some areas. Going to the Arizona Senate race, Mark Kelly won re-election here by a pretty wide margin. It was almost 5 points here. And this is pretty surprising to me. I'm not necessarily surprised that Mark Kelly won, but I am surprised that he won by this margin because Blake Masters was actually leading the polling average at the end. And I thought, because it was a midterm year, that the undecideds would break for Masters. But it turns out Mark Kelly was being underestimated in the polling here. He won by almost 5 points, which is a much wider margin than I expected. And part of this seemed to carry over to the governor race, where if we go to the nationwide map, we can see that Kari Lake actually lost. And I think this is probably the most shocking governor result, especially because Nevada went red, which I'll get to later. But the fact that Katie Hobbs won over Kari Lake is kind of an upset because Kari Lake was leading the polling here by a pretty decent margin for basically the entire cycle. And so the fact that Katie Hobbs won here definitely was a surprise to me. Moving to neighboring New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham was reelected to a second term as governor of New Mexico against Mark Ronchetti, who I thought was going to get close. I didn't think he was going to win. I thought he was going to lose by around 3 points, and he ended up losing by around 6 points, which is roughly in line with how the 2020 United States Senate election in New Mexico went, which also had Mark Ronchetti as the Republican nominee. I thought he was going to do better in this election. He did roughly the same. And I just underestimated Democrats in New Mexico overall because looking at the congressional map here, if it loads, we can see that in the 2nd district, Yvette Herrell actually lost to Gabriel Vasquez. I had this district going red basically the whole cycle, and ultimately the pundits agreed with me, and I was kind of tooting my own horn in the last House prediction that I called it that she was going to win, and ultimately she did end up losing, so that one came as a bit of a surprise to me, but she did lose very narrowly. Thought I'd touch on Alaska here too. People were yelling at me for saying that this was a likely Democrat race, but ultimately it looks like Mary Peltola is going to win by a pretty decent margin. It's going to go to a second round in ranked choice voting against Sarah Palin again, and she's probably going to win by a wide margin in that. I mean, the votes have already been cast, but I'm assuming that the Begich voters probably aren't breaking that much for Sarah Palin. So we'll just have to see how this one turns out, but Mary Peltola definitely won here. This might as well be called for her, but I understand why it's not. They still have to go through the second round of ranked choice voting. And now getting into the last of the really good results for Democrats, going to the Nevada congressional races. Lee, Titus, and Horsford were all reelected by pretty decent margins here. These two were reelected by 5-point margins, and Suzanne Lee was reelected by a 3-point margin, almost a 4-point margin, which I expected Lee to go down, but I did expect these two to be reelected. So this one, I mean, Nevada was a lot bluer, not a lot bluer, but pretty much bluer than I expected it to be in this election on all levels, which I'm going to get to in a sec. So I'm not entirely disappointed in my prediction here, but I did get it wrong. Going to the Nevada Senate race, Adam Laxalt lost here by the skin of his teeth against Catherine Cortez Masto, which I think is probably my worst Senate call. I had this as lean Republican. Actually, Pennsylvania was probably my worst, but this one probably surprised me the most. Laxalt was leading almost all polling leading up to the election, and the fact that he lost is kind of surprising to me. It was extremely close. I think this was a relatively good showing for Adam Laxalt, especially since he lost here a couple years ago in the governor race, but he did still lose here, and Masto was reelected to a second term in the Senate. And if we go into why here, we can see that she actually won Washoe County, which she lost in 2016 against Joe Heck. She won by a much smaller margin here in 2022 than she did in 2016, but she did flip Washoe County, which probably lent to her victory here. I chose Nevada as the segue from the good Democrat results to the good Republican results because in the governor election in Nevada, this one was actually the only Republican pickup of the night. Joe Lombardo was able to defeat Steve Sisolak somehow against all odds when the entire country basically had a blue or red ripple. Nevada governor actually kind of had a red wave and knocked off Steve Sisolak. And ultimately, Lombardo did end up winning by a smaller margin than I predicted, but I did still say he was going to win, so I'm going to take my wins where I can get them in my predictions. I did predict this, so you know what? I'll take it. And I was right to say that he was going to outperform Laxalt by a couple points, and I do think that that's mostly because he is from Clark County here. He only lost Clark County by less than 6 points. Let's see how Laxalt did. I actually don't know. So Laxalt lost this county by 8 points. So Lombardo outran Laxalt in Clark County by around 2 points and ended up outrunning him statewide by around 2 points. Lombardo also lost this county here, but he only lost it by 1, whereas Laxalt lost it by 4. So you can just see that Lombardo outperformed Laxalt basically statewide here. Despite the fact that Democrats ultimately outperformed all expectations here, Republicans did still have a lot of good results. So I'm going to go through those right now. I'm going to start with the state of Iowa. Kim Reynolds ended up winning re-election here by like 18 points, which is a huge margin. She only won by like 3 points in 2018, so she was able to expand her margin here. Iowa is very clearly now just a red state. It's not a swing state anymore. Kim Reynolds won here. And looking at the Senate election, we can see that Chuck Grassley also won here by 13 points, which is a lot closer than he usually is. He usually wins by over 20 points here. This is probably due to him aging and also just polarization. You know, I feel like a lot of people were weary about voting for an 89-year-old man for the Senate. Also, in the House of Representatives election here in Iowa, if it decides to load, we see that Zach Nunn beat Sidney Axney here very narrowly. I had this one as lean Republican, ended up being by less than 1 point, but Zach Nunn still ended up beating her, so now Republicans do have all 4 congressional districts in Iowa. There is actually a mixed bag state here that I missed and I forgot about, and that is the state of Ohio. We can see that congressional Democrats basically swept in Ohio here. Looking at the 13th district in Ohio here, or sorry, the 9th district, Marcy Kaptur won by 13 points here, which is way bigger margin than anyone was really expecting. J.R. Majewski only got 43% of the vote, which is actually fascinating. I did not think that this was going to be this blue. I did have Kaptur winning, but only very narrowly. I didn't think she was going to win by 13 points here. Going to the next district here, the 13th district, which I mentioned before accidentally. Amelia Sykes won here by 5 points, which I think was a bigger margin than people were expecting, but she did end up winning here. Democrats just kind of swept the competitive districts here. Going down to the 1st district, Steve Chabot, a longtime incumbent here, was knocked off by Greg Landsman. This district was trending towards Democrats. I did think that Chabot was going to hang on here just because I thought the environment was in Republicans' favor, but ultimately it wasn't, and Chabot did end up going down. In the Senate race here, J.D. Vance won against Tim Ryan by around 7 points. Actually, it's more like 6.5 points, which is a narrower margin than I expected, but a bigger margin than polls predicted. So we'll call that one kind of a wash here. I did have Ohio as likely Republican. I said Vance was going to win by a Trump-like margin, 8 to 9 points, and he only ended up winning by 6.5. I guess Tim Ryan ended up being a better candidate than I thought, and Vance was probably also helped by the fact that Mike DeWine won re-election here by 25 points, which is a huge margin. I did not think that DeWine was going to win by 20 points. I think in my video I said that he was going to come just short of 20 points margin of victory, and he ended up winning by 25 points here, which is incredible. That's all I really have to say about Ohio, but the Georgia governor race, Brian Kemp beat Stacey Abrams by about 7.5 points, which was kind of in line with polling. I think it was maybe a point underestimate of Stacey Abrams or so. But as you can see here, he outperformed Herschel Walker by around 9 points, which is a lot wider of a margin than I was expecting to ticket split here. And the results here are actually really interesting because if you look at a swing map here, which I don't have here, but Brian Kemp actually did a lot better in the rural areas than Donald Trump did, but the suburbs actually swung against him. I thought it was going to be the opposite. I thought that Brian Kemp was going to perform well in the suburbs of Atlanta, but he actually performed worse in the suburbs of Atlanta, and it was the rurals that ended up saving him here. So this just goes to show that Georgia really is trending against Republicans here, and that Brian Kemp was not lucky, really, because he's the incumbent governor, and he's done a pretty good job as governor, according to Georgians. But Georgia definitely is trending against Republicans, and this is going to be kind of like Virginia soon, a pretty Democratic state. But going back to the nationwide map in the governor elections, we can see that New York was actually one of the closest governor elections this cycle. Kathy Hochul only won by about 5.5 points, which is way closer than I expected. I had New York as likely Democrat. I thought Hochul was going to win by 8 or 9 points, and she ended up winning by only 5.5 points. Zeldin actually performed extremely well here. He gave up his congressional seat, but ultimately this helped Republicans down ballot and might have even helped them win the House. And I will get into the New York House elections here and how Zeldin's coattails definitely helped Republicans win the House. But I'm going to talk about just how insane the fact that New York was close is. It was closer than Maine's election. It was closer than Pennsylvania. It was closer than Michigan. It was only 2 points to the left of Wisconsin. It was closer than Minnesota. It was only 1 point to the left of Oregon. It was a couple points to the left of Arizona. It was closer than Colorado. It was about 3 points to the left of Kansas. So the fact that New York was really close to these states at all, let alone to the right of a lot of these states, is insane to me. It was closer than New Mexico, too. So even though this was not technically a win for Republicans, this was a great result for Republicans. The fact that a Democrat in New York only won by 5 points is crazy. And like I said before, Zeldin absolutely helped Republicans take back the House here. Going to the New York House of Representatives elections, there are a lot of candidates here who were not supposed to win that ultimately did end up winning. The most notable being Mike Lawler, who narrowly beat Sean Patrick Maloney. And this meant a lot because this district was supposed to be relatively safe for Maloney, and he ended up losing. He actually was, I think, in this district, but ended up moving to the 17th district because it was supposed to help him win. He was supposed to win by a bigger margin here, and he still ended up losing. The only competitive district in New York that ended up going Democrat was Pat Ryan's district. He was the incumbent here because he got elected in a special election earlier this year, and he still only won by less than 1 point. Mark Molinaro won here by 3 points. And going down to Long Island here, George Santos won by 9 points. That's a way bigger margin than anyone expected here. Anthony Disposito won by 3 points here. Andrew Garbarino, that was a safe district. Of course, he won there. Nick Lalata, he won easily. I think I had this one as either lean or likely, and it ended up being a double-digit margin. So New York was actually one of the best results nationwide for Republicans on the governor level and in the House level. And the fact that Zeldin's coattails helped Republicans here that much in a very narrow, unexpectedly House election, it probably gave Republicans the House here. Next, I'm going to talk about the state of Texas, which was also kind of a mixed bag, but mostly good for Republicans, other than down here in the Rio Grande Valley. Vicente Gonzalez ended up beating Mayra Flores by 8 points here, which was a much wider margin than I expected. I actually ultimately thought she was going to win because polling and aggregates ultimately had her leading, but she ended up losing by 8 points here. Henry Cuellar won by 13 points, which I definitely didn't expect. I thought this one was going to be very narrow. But in the 15th district here, Monica De La Cruz did end up beating Michelle Vallejo by a pretty wide margin. All of these were a lot more polar than I expected. I thought that they were all going to be pretty close, but they all ended up being blowouts for either party. And of course, going to the governor election, Greg Abbott won here by 11 points over Beto O'Rourke. And this is a tighter margin than Greg Abbott's 2018 election victory. He won by 13 points in 2018, and he only won by 11 in 2022. But that's a lot because Beto O'Rourke was a much more well-known candidate because he ran against Ted Cruz in 2018 and almost won, and he ran for president in 2020. So he was much more of a household name, and he still ended up losing by double digits. So I just thought that was worth mentioning. The final notable state I'm going to talk about is the Florida gubernatorial election. I had this one as solid Republican, but I definitely did not think it was going to be this solid Republican. Ron DeSantis won by 19.4 points, which is unreal. I think I said in my final prediction that DeSantis was going to win by 11 or 12, and he ended up winning by 19. Charlie Crist didn't even get 40% of the vote here. Ron DeSantis just blew him out of the water. Miami-Dade County went to Ron DeSantis by double digits. He ended up winning Palm Beach County. He won Pinellas County, which is Charlie Crist's home county. He won Hillsborough. I mean, this was an incredible result for Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis won by 1.5 million votes here, which is the biggest margin I think that has ever happened in Florida in my lifetime here. This is crazy. And Ron DeSantis' huge win probably contributed to the fact that the popular vote in the House elections actually was around R+4, which is around what I predicted. But ultimately, the House was extremely close. And that's because the bigger states and districts that were going either safe Republican or safe Democrat, Republicans outperformed, but in the swing districts, they actually underperformed, and Democrats did really well. So ultimately, what we saw in this election cycle was a reverse 2016. The polls overestimated Republicans in basically every important swing state, but the generic ballot was actually pretty accurate, and Republicans are poised to win it by around 4 points. Ultimately, my predictions were not very good, but I did use the data that I had and the polling just happened to be wrong here. It really is like the reverse 2016. I do blame myself partially for believing polls, but I do blame the data a little bit too. It was just errors all around, and hopefully in 2023 and 2024, I'll be able to extrapolate better numbers from the data that we have. Georgia Senate still has to go to a runoff, so I'll probably make a video about that. And at the time I'm recording this, Donald Trump is making a big announcement later tonight, so I will probably make a video on that if it is him running for president. So just stay tuned for that. But anyway, guys, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell if you like my content. Leave a like and comment if you like this video. I'd like to know what you thought, what your predictions were, and how well you guys did. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a great day.